This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Here's something that, welcome back to the program. Here's something I find very interesting. In the last hour, I shared with you the, number one, that the secession of at least South Carolina from the Union was all about slavery. Now, number two, slavery is all about labor and the asset of the slaves. In other words, the wealth of the South, you could argue was, lands and fields and farms and forests and things. But the real wealth of the South, going up toward the Civil War, was the slaves. This was the principal wealth, the principal, quote, property, end quote, that most of the slaveholders held was the value of their slaves. And the value of their slaves was not just the value of something you can buy and sell in the open market, but it was also the value of the work that could be done by those slaves. This is a point that has not been lost on the corporations of America today. They don't typically refer to people as slaves any longer. And in fact, I would argue that they've even figured out slick new ways to game the system so that, we're having to pick up more and more of the costs of people's lives, the cost of housing, the cost of food, the cost of shelter, the cost of clothing, the cost of education, things that, healthcare, things that, with the exception of education, might have been picked up by a slaveholder in the past. So now corporations, the modern day plantation owners, as it were, they've even figured out a way where they don't even have the costs of holding slaves. They just get the benefit. And then we discover that in 1936, Vance Muse starts this American Christian Association. Excuse me, the Christian American Association, and says this 1936. This is the official organization that is going to champion the right to work. The right to work in a workplace that does not have union representation. Why? Because the union representation protected people of color in the South. Now, the fact of the matter is, through the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and to some extent, I saw this through my own, my dad's eyes, I suppose. I spent a lot of time at Lansing Tool and Die when I was growing up. Metal Machining Company, the company that Dad ultimately ended up with. He worked for Lansing Tool and Die and Lansing Die Sinking, and then he ended up with Metal Machining Company for 30, 40 years. In that the unions back then in some parts of the country, and I would say that this is, to some extent the case in Lansing, at least from what I saw, were arguably still agents of segregation. I don't recall any people of color ever working in my dad's tool and die shop, even though it was located in the part of Lansing that was surrounded by, a couple of square miles of people of color. So unions were used in the United States, and we have to acknowledge this. Unions were used in the United States throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s to keep the workplace segregated in many places. But in the South, there were many places where unions were also used to elevate the political power status, the workplace power status of people of color as well. And so Vance Muse came along and said, we can't have this. And his sister talking about liberally using the N-word about her servant, her maid, this, that, and the other thing, and they started this Christian American Association and invented this right to work phrase. And now Scott Walker in Wisconsin, after passing a voter ID law that makes it harder for people of color, urban dwellers, young people, and old people in the state of Wisconsin to vote, now is pushing through right to work for less legislation that I mean, he already, as he told that billionaire woman a year or so ago that got caught on videotape, where she said, what can we do to flip the state red? And he's like, I'm going to take the unions on, and I'm going to play divide and conquer. I'm going to first go after the public sector unions, because a lot of citizens can't figure out why somebody who works for the state, has a pretty good job, needs a union. And then once we've taken down the public sector unions, then we'll go after the private sector unions, the for-profit sector unions, which is what they're doing right now. Even though during the last election, when he was running for re-election as governor, he said, no, I'm not going to go after those unions. He lied. Just like he said, no, I'm not going to go after abortion. He lied. Scott Walker is a liar. I mean, this is just part of his political history. And there's a lot of folks still sitting around scratching their heads going, why did he leave college? I've had this story told to me by several different people. Well, I don't want to repeat a story that I can't document. But I think the question, did Scott Walker get kicked out of college because of political shenanigans? He was running for student council or something like that. And was he kicked out of college because he got busted stealing newspapers that might have had an editorial that was unfavorable to him or something like that? The stories are out there. Whether they're true or not is something that has to be determined. But inquiring minds want to know. But anyhow, my point is that Right to Work for Less shares a racist history with secession, and shares, frankly, in my opinion, a racist history with the largely white, middle class, and mostly boomer generation Tea Party. These are the people who were the white racists in the 50s and 60s and 70s, screaming at people of color who wanted to go to college or who wanted to go to school. This is the direction this country is going. And meanwhile, we have our corporations. I mean, it's like a free-for-all. You've got the corporations saying, no, we're going to take all that money and give it to our CEOs and stockholders. This is what I was talking about last week, this new Roosevelt Institute report on how corporations are taking most of their profits now. They used to reinvest their profits in equipment, in research and development, in marketing, in growing their business. They no longer do that. They now take their profits and use that money to buy back their stock, thus raising the value of their stock because they're stockholders. Now, prior to the Reagan administration, CEOs were not stockholders in companies. I mean, they could be, but they could not be compensated with stock. They could go out and buy the stock, but they didn't get it for working there. And Reagan changed those rules, and so now we've got an entire nation full of CEOs, many of whom, and arguably most of whom, don't give a damn about the company, don't care about the employees, don't care about the customers, don't care about the product, don't care about the community. The only thing they care about is jacking the stock price up. And so now, the S&P went through 5,000 yesterday. The Dow is over whatever it is. And people say, oh, look at the economy is doing great. The stock market's up. No, the stock market's up because the businesses that are represented on the stock exchange, on the New York Stock Exchange and all the various other ones, that these businesses are behaving in a way that doesn't increase the value of the company. It only increases the value of the stock. If a company's worth $1 billion and they have 1 million shares, each share is arguably worth $1,000. If they buy back half those shares, every share becomes worth $2,000. Does that mean that the company's worth twice as much? No, it's worth the exact same amount. So you've got the rich playing these games to get rich. Meanwhile, they're trying to stop anybody from participating in a union.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And they send their toadies out like Scott Walker, and then they fund things like the Competitive Enterprise Institute to blow up the Affordable Care Act.